It's the summer of 2010, Johannesburg. Soccer City Stadium glows orange under the African night. 90,000 people are screaming. And Andres Iniesta is sprinting across the pitch, ripping off his shirt, 4 words scrawled underneath in marker pen. He's just scored the goal that makes Spain world champions for the first time in their history. The commentators lose their minds. The headlines the next morning bell it a coronation, a new dynasty, the best team the world has ever seen. But buried inside that victory is a fact almost nobody mentioned in that night. A fact that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Because Spain, this golden generation, this once-in-a-century team, had just done something no European nation had ever managed in 80 years of football. They'd won the World Cup outside of Europe. And here's the part that should stop you cold. In the entire history of the tournament, through 22 editions, 90-odd years, hundreds of nations, billions of dollars, and some of the greatest athletes who ever lived, only 8 countries have ever won it. 8. And every single one of them comes from just 2 continents on Earth. Tonight, we're going to answer a question that sits at the very heart of football and that almost nobody can explain properly. Why has the World Cup, the most global event humanity has ever created, watched by more people than the moon landing, been won for nearly a century by the same tiny handful of nations? Why has no team from Africa ever won it? No team from Asia? No team from North America? And the strangest pattern of all, the one that breaks even the great dynasties, why is it so brutally, almost impossibly hard to win this thing far from home? This is the story of the most exclusive club in sport, how it was built, why the doors have stayed locked for 90 years, and whether, in the summer of 2026, the lock is finally about to break. Let's begin. Part 1, the Club of 8. To understand how strange this is, you have to understand the scale of what we're talking about. There are 211 nations registered with FIFA. That's more members than the United Nations. From the islands of the Pacific to the deserts of the Sahara, from the mountains of Asia to the cities of the Americas, 211 flags, 211 anthems, 211 nations that all dream the same dream every 4 years. And in 90 years, exactly 8 of them have ever touched the trophy. Brazil, Germany, Italy, Argentina, France, Uruguay, England, Spain. Read that list again, and a pattern jumps out immediately. 4 of them are European, 4 of them are South American. There is no third category, no outsider, no surprise. The World Cup has been a private conversation between 2 continents, and everyone else on Earth has been standing outside the window, watching. Brazil leads them all with 5 titles, the only nation to play in every single World Cup ever held. Germany has 4. Italy has 4. Argentina, 3. And then the smaller dynasties. Uruguay, who won the very first one in 1930 and stunned the world again in 1950. France. England, who won once at home in 1970, and Spain, the latecomer, who didn't win until 2010. 8 nations, 2 continents, 90 years. Now, you might think the explanation is obvious. These are the football countries, right? This is where the sport is best. Of course they win, but that's not an explanation. That's just the pattern described back to you in different words. The real question is, why? Why these 8 and nobody else? When nations like the United States have more money, more athletes, more sports science than almost anyone on Earth, have they never even reached a final? Why, when Africa produces some of the most gifted footballers the game has ever seen, players who light up the biggest clubs in Europe every single weekend, has no African nation ever lifted the trophy? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. Because the door to this club wasn't locked by accident, it was built that way. Part 2, how the doors got locked. In 1930, when the first World Cup kicked off in Uruguay, football was not a global game. It was a European and South American game, and barely even that. The first tournament had just 13 teams. To get to Uruguay, the European nations had to cross the Atlantic by boat, a journey of 2 to 3 weeks. Most of them simply refused to go. Football's heartlands were already drawn, and they were drawn around the Atlantic, the coastlines of Western Europe and the southern cone of South America. For the next 20 years, that's where the trophy stayed. Italy won twice in the 1930s. Uruguay and Brazil traded blows across the ocean, and a quiet, invisible rule began to form. A rule nobody wrote down, but everybody obeyed. The World Cup was won at home, or close to it. Look at the early decades and the pattern is almost eerie. Uruguay win the first one, at home. Italy win in 1934, at home. When the tournament went to Brazil in 1950, the whole nation was so certain of victory, they printed the celebration newspapers in advance. Football belonged to its founders, and its founders did not lose on their own soil. But the deeper lock, the one that's still in place today, was something else entirely. It was the simple, crushing reality that to win this tournament run, you don't just need great players. You need an entire football civilization behind you. You need youth academies that have existed for generations. You need domestic leagues that forge players in the fire of weekly pressure. You need a coaching culture, a tactical inheritance passed down like a family recipe. You need millions of children playing in the street from the moment they can walk, because that's where genius gets discovered. And you need decades of failure and heartbreak and near misses to learn the brutal lessons this tournament teaches. Europe and South America had a head start of half a century, and in football, that head start compounds. The rich get richer, the good get better. The winners produce the coaches who produce the next winners. So while the rest of the world was still learning the rules, these 8 nations were already writing the textbook. Part 3, the curse of the away game. But here's where the story takes a twist that even hardcore fans rarely think about. It's not just that outsiders can't win. It's that even the insiders, the giants, the dynasties, the greatest teams ever assembled, find it almost impossible to win far from home. Consider this. For the first 80 years of World Cup history, no European nation ever won the tournament outside of Europe. Not once. Not the great Italian sides. Not the brilliant Dutch teams of the 70s. Not the German machine. Whenever the World Cup left Europe and crossed an ocean, the European powers, the favorites, the bookmakers' darlings, crumbled. In 1950 in Brazil, a South American won. In 1962 in Chile, a South American won. In 1970 in Mexico, Brazil won. In 1978 in Argentina, the hosts won. Again and again when the tournament was played in the Americas, a South American team lifted the trophy. And when it was played in Europe, a European team almost always did. It was as if the trophy had gravity, as if it refused to be carried too far from familiar soil. Why? Part of it is the obvious. Heat, altitude, humidity. When Mexico hosted in 1970 and again in 1986, European teams arrived from cool northern springs and ran straight into thin mountain air and blistering midday sun. Kickoff times set not for the players, but for European television audiences. Their lungs burned. Their legs died in the final 20 minutes. The South Americans, raised in those conditions, simply outlasted them. Part of it is distance and time. The brutal toll of travel, jet lag, strange food, foreign crowds, months away from home. And part of it is something harder to measure. Call it belonging. A South American team in South America isn't just playing a match. It's playing in front of a continent that shares its language, its rhythm, its understanding of the game. The crowd breathes with them. The very air feels like home. For 80 years, that gravity held. The World Cup was a tournament you won in your own backyard. And then, in 2010, in South Africa, Spain broke it. Part 4, the generation that cracked the code. To understand why Spain's 2010 win matters so much, you have to understand just how impossible it was supposed to be. Spain had been football's great underachievers. For decades, they produced beautiful teams that flattered to deceive, gifted, elegant, and always somehow going home early. They had never won a World Cup, ever, not once in 80 years of trying. And now they were supposed to do it on another continent, in conditions no European team had ever conquered. But this Spain was different. This was the generation built at Barcelona's famous academy, La Masia, a system that took children and turned them into a single, telepathic organism. They played a style the world had never quite seen at this intensity. Keep the ball, always, relentlessly, until the opponent simply died of exhaustion chasing it. Possession as a weapon. Patience as violence. They didn't overpower teams. They suffocated them. And crucially, that style traveled. It didn't depend on home crowds or familiar weather. It depended only on the ball and their absolute mastery of it. In South Africa, they barely scored. 4 of their 7 games ended 1-0. It wasn't beautiful in the way people expected. It was something colder. A machine methodically dismantling the curse that had held for 80 years. And when Iniesta scored that goal in the final minutes against the Netherlands, Spain didn't just win their first World Cup. They proved the lock could be picked. For the first time, a European team had crossed an ocean and won. The gravity that had ruled the tournament for nearly a century had finally, after 80 years, been overcome. But notice what still didn't happen. Spain were European. The club of 8 didn't grow. The door to the 2-continent monopoly stayed firmly shut. All Spain proved was that an insider could now win anywhere. The outsiders were still outside. Part 5, so close and yet. So if the geographic curse can be broken, why hasn't an outsider ever won? Because they've come close. Heartbreakingly, agonizingly close. And every time they've hit an invisible ceiling. In 2002, South Korea, co-hosting the tournament, went on a run that electrified the planet, reaching the semifinals. The first Asian team ever to get that far. The whole nation turned red. And there, in the Final Four, the run ended. In 1990, Cameroon, the indomitable Lions, captured the world's heart, beating the defending champions in the opening game and charging to the quarterfinals. The first African team to get that close. And there against England in extra time, it ended. Ghana in 2010 were one penalty kick away from becoming the first African team in a World Cup semifinal. One kick. The striker stepped up in the final seconds. He missed. They lost the shootout. An entire continent's hopes died in a single moment. And then, Morocco, 22. Qatar. The Atlas Lions did what no African or Arab team had ever done. They reached the semifinals, knocking out Spain and Portugal along the way, playing with a unity and a fearlessness that made them the neutrals' favorite team on earth. For 2 weeks, it felt like history itself was bending. And there, in the semifinal, France stopped them. Do you see the pattern? Quarterfinal, semifinal, one step from the summit. The outsiders keep climbing higher and higher up the mountain. But the last few feet, the part that requires not just talent, but generational depth. A whole bench full of world-class players, the institutional memory of how to win a knockout game at this exact altitude. That final stretch has belonged every single time to the club of 8. The gap isn't talent anymore. Africa and Asia produce world-class individuals by the hundreds. The gap is depth. It's the difference between 11 brilliant players and a squad of 23 who have all won the biggest games of their lives, coached by men whose fathers coached them, inside systems that have been winning for 100 years. That's the wall. And for 90 years, nobody's been able to climb over it. Part 6, 2026. The year the wall could fall. Which brings us to now. In the summer of 2026, the World Cup changes forever. For the first time in history, it expands to 48 teams, the biggest tournament ever staged. And it's being hosted across 3 nations of a continent that has never won it: the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Think about what that means. More teams from Africa than ever before. More teams from Asia. More teams from the very continents that have spent 90 years knocking on the door. A wider field, more chaos, more chances for the impossible. And it's being played in North America, on home soil for a region that has never lifted the trophy, in front of crowds that, for the first time, might give an outsider that intangible thing that's always belonged to the giants: the feeling of home. The conditions that broke European teams for decades. The heat, the altitude, the distance. Now cut the other way. It's the Europeans who will be crossing oceans. It's the South Americans, at least, who will feel closer to home. The gravity of the tournament is shifting. So the question that's haunted this sport for 90 years has never been more alive than it is right now. Can an outsider finally win? Can an African nation, Morocco, building on 2022, or Senegal, or any of a dozen rising powers, finally climb those last few feet? Can the United States, with all its resources and a generation of players forged in Europe's best leagues, do it on home soil the way England did in '66 and Argentina in '78? Can the Club of 8, locked for 90 years finally admit a 9th member? Or will the wall hold one more time? Here's what history tells us. The pattern is old. The advantages are deep. 90 years of momentum doesn't vanish in a single summer. The smart money, as always, sits with the giants. But here's what history also tells us. Every wall that's ever stood in this tournament has eventually fallen. They said a European team could never win abroad, until Spain did. They said an African team could never reach a semifinal, until Morocco did. Every never in football's history has a date stamped on it, the day it stopped being true. The only question is whether 2026 is one of those dates. 8 nations, 2 continents, 90 years. And somewhere out there right now, in a training ground far from Europe and far from South America, there's a team getting ready to find out if the most exclusive club in sport is about to open its doors for the first time in living memory. The lock is held for 90 years.